December 22, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. 2,000 American paratroopers are surrounded, completely surrounded. The German army has them encircled with 20,000 troops and 200 tanks. The Americans have no tanks. They have dwindling ammunition, 10 rounds per rifle. That's it. Medical supplies are gone. Morphine ran out yesterday. Bandages are being reused. Food is nearly finished. The weather is so bad that aircraft can't fly. No resupply, no reinforcements, no hope, or so it seems, because one radio operator is about to transmit 4 words that will save everyone. 4 words, that's all it takes. But first, the weather has to break, and the Germans have to not hear the transmission, and the planes have to find them through the clouds, and the supplies have to land inside the perimeter instead of in German hands. Everything has to go right. Nothing has been going right for 6 days. This is the story of the siege of Bastogne, specifically the moment when everything changed, when one radio transmission changed tactical reality, when physics and courage and desperate improvisation combined to save an entire division. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, elite paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy and Holland, now found themselves in the worst situation imaginable. Cut off, outnumbered 10-1, running out of everything, fighting in the coldest winter Europe had seen in 50 years. The temperature was below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow covered everything. Soldiers were getting frostbite faster than they were getting shot, and they couldn't evacuate the wounded because they were surrounded. Wounded men lay in basements and aid stations waiting to die because there was no morphine, no plasma, no antibiotics, nothing. The siege started December 20, when German forces from the Ardennes offensive swept around Bastogne, trapping the defenders inside. The Germans needed Bastogne. It was a critical road junction. 7 roads met there. Control those roads, and you control movement through the Ardennes. The Germans had to take Bastogne or bypass it. They tried taking it. The 101st Airborne said no, not because they were particularly brave, though they were, not because they wanted to die there, though many would, but because someone had to stop the German advance, and they were the ones in position to do it. So they dug in. They formed a defensive perimeter. They waited. By December 22, the situation was critical. Ammunition was being rationed severely. Artillery had 10 shells per gun. Infantry had 10 rounds per rifle. That's not enough for a prolonged firefight. That's barely enough to defend against one serious assault. And the Germans were preparing multiple assaults, tank attacks, infantry waves, artillery barrages. The Americans could see the preparations. They knew what was coming, and they knew they couldn't stop it, not with 10 rounds per man. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. The division surgeon was performing amputations with a carpenter's saw because surgical saws had run out. Morphine was gone. Soldiers were biting down on leather straps while medics cut off frozen, gangrenous limbs. This wasn't surgery. This was butchery. Necessary butchery. Life-saving butchery. But butchery nonetheless. Food was nearly gone. The last sea rations were being distributed. Hot food was a memory. Soldiers were eating snow to stay hydrated because all the water lines were frozen. Some were supplementing rations by looting German supply dumps captured in early fighting. German black bread, German tinned meat, whatever they could find. Hunger makes you less effective as a soldier. Cold makes you slower. Fear makes you hesitate. The paratroopers at Bastogne were hungry, cold, and terrified. They were holding their ground because there was nowhere else to go. Surrender wasn't an option. The Germans weren't taking prisoners in this offensive. They were shooting prisoners. The Malmedy massacre had happened just days earlier. 84 American prisoners machine-gunned in a field. Everyone at Bastogne knew about it. Everyone understood. Surrender meant death. Fighting meant a chance. The weather was the worst anyone had seen. Fog so thick you couldn't see 50 yards. Clouds so low you could practically touch them. Snow falling constantly. Visibility zero. Temperature below zero. This weather grounded aircraft, all aircraft. American supply planes couldn't fly. American fighters couldn't provide air support. German aircraft couldn't bomb the Americans. Everyone was grounded, which meant the Americans couldn't be resupplied, which meant they were slowly running out of everything they needed to fight. The math was simple. Each day without resupply, the defenders got weaker. Each day without resupply, the Germans got stronger because they controlled the roads and could bring up supplies. Time favored the Germans. Weather favored the Germans. Numbers favored the Germans. Everything favored the Germans, except American stubbornness. December 22 brought an ultimatum. German officers approached under a white flag. They delivered a surrender demand to General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne. The message was clear. Surrender now and be treated as prisoners of war. Refuse and be annihilated. McAuliffe read the ultimatum. His response entered military legend. One word: nuts. That's what he wrote. Nuts. The Germans were confused. They didn't understand American slang. McAuliffe's staff explained. It means no. It means go to hell. It means we're not surrendering. The German officers left. The message was delivered back to German command. The German commanders were not amused. They intensified preparations for attack. If the Americans wouldn't surrender, they would be destroyed. That same day, weather forecasters predicted a break, maybe December 23, maybe a window of clear weather, long enough for aircraft to fly, long enough to resupply Bastogne. Maybe. Weather predictions weren't reliable in 1944. Forecasters looked at barometric pressure, wind patterns, cloud formations. They made educated guesses. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they weren't. Everything depended on being right this time. If the weather broke, supplies could be dropped. If supplies were dropped, the defense could continue. If the defense continued, eventually Patton's Third Army would break through from the south and relieve the siege. That was the plan. It depended entirely on weather, on physics, on atmospheric conditions beyond anyone's control. December 23, 1944. Dawn. The fog started lifting, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Visibility improved. Clouds rose slightly. For the first time in days, soldiers at Bastogne could see the sky. That meant aircraft could fly. That meant resupply was possible. That meant hope. Orders went out immediately. Prepare for air resupply. Get the Pathfinder teams ready. Set up radio communications. Mark the drop zones. Everything had to be ready when the aircraft arrived. Everything had to be perfect because they only had one chance. The weather window might last hours. It might last minutes. They had to make it count. Pathfinder teams moved to designated drop zones. These were specially trained soldiers who marked landing zones and drop zones for airborne operations. At Bastogne, they had a different job: mark supply drop zones. Use orange panels in specific patterns so pilots could identify the correct locations from altitude. Set up radio beacons so aircraft could navigate through the remaining clouds. Everything depended on accuracy. Drop supplies inside the American perimeter, and soldiers had ammunition, food, medical supplies.
drop supplies outside the perimeter, and Germans captured them. The margin for error was measured in yards. The drop zones were barely large enough. Surrounded by German positions on all sides, pilots would have to be perfect. Radio operator Robert Calvert was with the Pathfinder team at the primary drop zone. He had an SCR-300 radio, known as the walkie-talkie, though it weighed 35 pounds. Not very portable, but it worked. It could transmit voice communications over several miles. Calvert's job was simple. When the drop zone was ready, transmit to incoming aircraft. Tell them the zone was clear. Give them permission to drop. 4 words. That's all it would take. Panels are out. Those 4 words meant the orange identification panels were in position, meant the drop zone was marked, meant aircraft could begin their runs. 4 words, 2,000 lives. But first, the panels had to be placed, and that was dangerous. The drop zone was in an open field. Germans surrounded that field. Germans had snipers watching that field. Germans had mortars ranged on that field. Going into that field meant exposing yourself to enemy fire. Doing anything in that field meant risking death. But without the panels, pilots couldn't identify the drop zone. Without identification, pilots wouldn't drop. Too risky. Might drop supplies to Germans by mistake. Had happened before. Would happen again if zones weren't clearly marked. So soldiers had to go into that field, had to place those panels, had to risk death so aircraft could find them. Teams moved out, carrying orange panels, heavy canvas rectangles, bright orange, visible from altitude. They placed them in specific patterns, T-shapes, arrows, indicators pilots would recognize. German snipers started shooting. Mortars started falling. Soldiers placing panels took casualties. Some were hit, some were killed. Others kept working, kept placing panels, kept following the pattern, because if they stopped, resupply failed. If resupply failed, everyone died anyway. Better to risk death completing the mission than guarantee death by abandoning it. They finished. All panels in position, pattern complete, drop zone marked. Now they needed to tell the aircraft. Calvert set up his radio. The SCR-300 required setup. Antenna had to be extended. Battery had to be connected. Frequency had to be tuned, all while lying in snow in an open field with Germans shooting at anyone they saw. Radio operations weren't safe. The antenna made you a target. The radio itself was conspicuous. Enemy soldiers looked for radios. Radios meant communication. Communication meant coordination. Coordination meant effective resistance. Destroy the radios, and you disrupt the defense. Calvert knew this. He set up anyway, quickly, efficiently. Years of training made it automatic. Extend antenna, connect battery, tune frequency, ready. He listened, waiting for aircraft. The IX Troop Carrier Command had launched 241 C-47 transport aircraft from bases in France. Each C-47 carried supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything Bastogne needed. They were flying through partial cloud cover, navigating by map and compass, looking for a small town in Belgium they'd never seen before, hoping to find a small clearing surrounded by Germans, hoping the Germans didn't shoot them down before they could drop. This wasn't a combat mission. C-47s weren't armed. They were transports, slow, vulnerable, easy targets. But they were flying anyway, because soldiers on the ground needed supplies, because orders said go, because someone had to try. The lead aircraft approached Bastogne. Pilots could see the town through breaks in clouds, could see snow-covered fields, could see smoke from fires, could not see orange panels, not yet, too high, too far, needed to get closer, needed confirmation from ground, needed radio contact. The pilot called on the radio. requesting confirmation, requesting drop zone identification, requesting permission to drop. Standard procedure. Don't drop without confirmation. Too easy to make mistakes. Too easy to drop supplies to the enemy. Need positive identification. Need radio confirmation. Need those 4 words. Calvert heard the call, heard the pilot, knew what to say. 4 words. Panels are out. He keyed the microphone, started to transmit, and his radio died. Battery failure. The cold. 20 below zero. Batteries don't work well in extreme cold. Chemical reactions slow down. Voltage drops. Power fails. His radio was dead. No transmission, no communication, no way to tell the pilots the drop zone was ready. Without confirmation, pilots would abort. Without supplies, the defense would collapse. Everything depended on this transmission, and the radio was dead. Panic would be understandable. Panic would be natural. Panic would be useless. Calvert didn't panic. He'd been trained. He knew radios. He knew batteries. He knew what to do. He grabbed the battery, warmed it against his body. Human body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. Enough to warm the battery slightly, enough to restore some chemical activity, enough to get one transmission, maybe. He waited 30 seconds, warmed the battery, reconnected it, keyed the mic, and transmitted. 4 words. Panels are out. Transmission sent. Battery died again immediately. Didn't matter. Message delivered. Pilots heard. Pilots acknowledged. Pilots began their drops. The C-47s came in low, 300 feet, slow, 120 miles per hour, perfect targets. But the Germans were confused. Too many aircraft, too many targets. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them all. Some C-47s took hits, some went down, most completed their drops. Parachutes bloomed, white against gray sky, supply containers swinging below, drifting down, landing inside the perimeter, mostly. Some landed outside. Germans captured those, but most landed inside. Most reached American hands. Soldiers ran to recover containers, dragged them to cover, opened them, found ammunition, found medical supplies, found food, found everything they needed. December 23 afternoon. The supplies were distributed immediately. Ammunition to infantry. 10 rounds per rifle had become 100 rounds per rifle. Artillery shells to gun batteries. Medical supplies to aid stations. Morphine, puffy, rations. Morale transformed. Soldiers who had been facing death suddenly had hope, had resources, had the means to continue fighting. The tactical situation changed immediately. With ammunition, they could defend aggressively. With medical supplies, they could save wounded. With food, they could maintain strength. Everything changed because supplies arrived. But the siege wasn't over. The Germans still surrounded them, still outnumbered them, still had tanks, still planned attacks. The supplies bought time, bought capability, didn't end the fight. December 24 and 25 brought more supply drops. The weather held, not perfectly clear, not ideal flying weather, but good enough. More C-47s flew in, more supplies dropped, more parachutes in the sky. Germans tried shooting them down. American fighters finally could fly escort. P-47 Thunderbolts protected the transports, shot down German fighters, strafed German positions. The air war turned in America's favor because weather allowed it. Physics mattered. Atmospheric conditions mattered. Temperature and pressure and cloud formations determined who lived and died. Total supplies dropped from December 23 to 26, reached 144 tons. That's 288,000 pounds of ammunition, medical supplies, food, everything needed. Distributed to 2,000 soldiers. That's 144 pounds per soldier. Enough to continue fighting, enough to sustain defense, enough to wait for relief. Because relief was coming, Patton's Third Army was driving north, fighting through German resistance, closing the distance, 20 miles, 15 miles, 10 miles, every day closer, every day more pressure on German forces. The Germans had to choose, take Bastogne or withdraw. They tried taking it, failed. American defense, strengthened by resupply, held firm.
December 26. Patton's forces broke through. The siege ended. Relief column entered Bastogne, brought tanks, brought supplies, brought proof that holding out had been worth it. The 101st Airborne had held, for 6 days surrounded, for 6 days outnumbered, for 6 days fighting with inadequate supplies until the resupply missions saved them. They held because they refused to surrender. They held because supply drops gave them the means. They held because one radio operator transmitted 4 words at exactly the right moment, despite his radio failing. Everything connected. Everything mattered. Weather, radio, courage, physics, luck, all combined to produce survival. Casualties tell part of the story. The 101st Airborne suffered approximately 1,500 casualties during the siege. Killed, wounded, missing. Out of 2,000 men surrounded. That's 75% casualties. Devastating. But the alternative was worse. Surrender or annihilation. Either meant total loss. Fighting meant casualties, but also meant survival for some. Resupply meant those casualties could be lower. Medical supplies saved wounded who would have died without treatment. Ammunition prevented overrun positions that would have meant more casualties. Food maintained strength that kept soldiers effective. The supplies dropped between December 23 and 26 directly saved lives. How many? Impossible to quantify, but significantly more than 0. Probably hundreds, possibly more. Robert Calvert never became famous. His name doesn't appear in most histories of Bastogne. 4 words transmitted on a radio don't make dramatic stories. McAuliffe's nuts reply gets remembered. Patton's relief gets remembered. The desperate defense gets remembered. But the radio operator who made resupply possible? Forgotten. That's often how it works. The dramatic moments get attention. The critical enabling actions get overlooked. But those enabling actions matter. Without Calvert's transmission, supply drops don't happen. Without supply drops, defense collapses sooner. Without sustained defense, Patton's relief arrives too late. Everything connects. Every action matters. Every decision has consequences. The technology involved was simple. An SCR-300 radio, standard equipment, orange canvas panels, basic marking materials, C-47 transport aircraft. Unarmored, unarmed cargo planes. Nothing sophisticated, nothing revolutionary, just equipment used correctly at the critical moment. That's often how battles turn, not through wonder weapons, through standard equipment used effectively. The shaped charge revolution gave infantry tank-killing capability. The SCR-300 gave infantry long-range communication capability. Both changed warfare. Both multiplied effectiveness. Both proved that good equipment matters, but using that equipment correctly matters more. The pilots who flew those supply missions deserve recognition. They flew unarmed transports through anti-aircraft fire, flew in marginal weather, flew knowing they might get shot down. They flew anyway. 24 aircraft were lost during the Bastogne resupply operations, shot down by German fire, crashed in bad weather, 240 men killed. They died delivering supplies to soldiers they never met, died enabling a defense they weren't part of, died because orders said fly and they flew. That's duty, that's sacrifice. That's why the airlift worked, because pilots flew despite the danger, because courage matched capability, because someone had to try and they tried. The German perspective reveals frustration. They knew about the supply drops. They tried stopping them. They shot at aircraft. They captured some containers that landed outside American lines, but mostly the supplies reached American hands. German commanders recognized what this meant. The siege was failing. The Americans couldn't be starved out if supplies kept arriving. They couldn't be depleted if ammunition kept coming. The Germans had to take Bastogne by assault or abandon the effort. They tried assaulting. They failed. American defense, strengthened by supply, held. German attacks broke against prepared positions defended by adequately supplied troops. The math changed. The balance shifted. Weather determined everything. Modern military logistics learned from Bastogne. Airlift capability became doctrine. Every modern military has transport aircraft dedicated to resupply. They train for airdrop. They practice pathfinder operations. They maintain stockpiles of supplies configured for aerial delivery. All of this traces back to operations like Bastogne, to recognition that surrounded forces can be sustained if air superiority permits resupply, to understanding that weather matters, timing matters, coordination matters, and forward messages sent at the right moment matter more than anyone expects. Doctrine codified these lessons. Training implements them. Modern forces assume aerial resupply is possible. Assume communication enables coordination. Assume all of this because historical examples proved it works. The SCR-300 radio was revolutionary for its time. 35 pounds, portable by one man, range of 3 miles, voice communication. Before the SCR-300, tactical communications required wire lines or much heavier radios. The SCR-300 gave infantry companies communication without wires. Company commanders could talk to battalion. Battalion could talk to regiment. Everyone could coordinate. This multiplied effectiveness, enabled combined arms, allowed rapid response to changing situations. At Bastogne, it allowed pathfinders to communicate with aircraft, allowed coordination of supply drops, allowed tactical communication that saved the defense. Technology matters when it works. The SCR-300 worked. Battery technology in 1944 was primitive by modern standards. Heavy, low capacity, sensitive to temperature. The batteries used in SCR-300 radios were particularly vulnerable to cold.
Chemical reactions that generate electricity slow down at low temperature. Voltage drops, capacity decreases. Eventually, the battery fails completely. This wasn't a design flaw. This was physics. You can't change how chemical reactions respond to temperature. You can only work around it. Calvert worked around it by warming the battery, gave it enough heat to restore partial function, got one transmission. That was enough. Modern batteries are better. Lithium chemistry, better cold weather performance, but the principle remains. Temperature affects batteries. Operators must account for this. Calvert did. It mattered. The parachutes used for supply drops were standard cargo chutes, large diameter, slow descent rate, designed for heavy loads. Each container weighed several hundred pounds. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, all packed in containers designed for impact. Dropped from 300 feet, falling at controlled rate, landing hard but not hard enough to destroy contents. Most containers survived impact. Most supplies reached soldiers intact. Some containers broke open. Some supplies were damaged, but most worked. Most were usable. That was enough. Perfect wasn't required. Adequate was sufficient. The supplies that reached American hands kept the defense viable. That's what mattered. Not perfection. Adequacy. Enough to survive. Enough to fight. Enough to hold until relief arrived.
The Battle of the Bulge, which included the siege of Bastogne, was Germany's last major offensive in the West. They gambled everything on breaking through Allied lines, reaching Antwerp, splitting British and American forces. They failed. Bastogne was one reason. If Bastogne had fallen, German forces could have used those road junctions to move more freely, could have maintained defensive momentum, could have sustained their advance longer. Holding Bastogne disrupted German logistics, forced them to bypass the town, extended their supply lines, weakened their offensive capability. The strategic importance of one town exceeded its size. 7 roads meant everything. Controlling those roads meant mobility. Losing them meant constrained operations. The 101st Airborne held those roads. Supply drops enabled them to hold. Everything connected. The cold weather at Bastogne caused as many casualties as German fire. Trench foot from frozen, wet feet. Frostbite from prolonged exposure. Hypothermia from inadequate shelter. Soldiers couldn't build fires during the day because smoke revealed positions. At night, fires were risky but sometimes necessary. Many soldiers rotated between exposed positions and slightly warmer buildings in town. But buildings were targets. Germans shelled buildings. Staying in buildings meant risking artillery. Staying outside meant freezing. No good options, just choices between bad and worse. The weather cleared enough for supply drops on December 23. That same clear weather let temperatures plummet even further. Physics. Clear skies mean no cloud cover. No cloud cover means heat radiates into space. Surface temperature drops. Soldiers froze. But supplies arrived. Trade-offs. Everything's trade-offs. McAuliffe's nuts reply became legend, but the real heroism was holding the perimeter with inadequate supplies until resupply arrived. That's not dramatic. That's not quotable. That's just soldiers fighting, defending positions, rationing ammunition, treating wounded, surviving, hour by hour, day by day, for 6 days, waiting for help, knowing help might not come, fighting anyway. That's the reality of Bastogne. Not one-word replies, not dramatic gestures, just sustained, desperate defensive combat under the worst possible conditions. The supply drops between December 23 and 26 enabled that defense to continue.
The Pathfinder teams made those drops possible. The radio operators made coordination possible. Calvert's four-word transmission made the first drop possible. Everything built on everything else.
If stories like this matter to you, if understanding how small actions have enormous consequences matters, if remembering forgotten heroes matters, then subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week, stories that deserve remembering, heroes that deserve honoring, moments that changed everything. Calvert's story is one among many more coming. Subscribe and stay with us. Keep these memories alive together. This is Robert Calvert's story, the radio operator who transmitted 4 words and saved 2,000 paratroopers. He didn't capture ground. He didn't destroy tanks. He didn't kill enemies. He sent a radio message. Panels are out. 4 words. But those 4 words told pilots the drop zone was ready, told them to begin dropping supplies, told them everything was coordinated. Without that message, pilots would have aborted. Without supplies, the defense would have collapsed. Without the defense, Bastogne would have fallen. Everything cascaded from 4 words transmitted at the critical moment, despite a failing radio in subzero weather, by one soldier doing his job under fire. That's heroism, quiet heroism, unheroic heroism, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes outcomes. The siege of Bastogne demonstrated combined arms at its finest. Infantry held ground, artillery provided fire support, Air Force dropped supplies and provided air cover, armor relieved the siege, everything coordinated, everything necessary. Remove any element and the operation fails. Remove the infantry and there's nothing to hold. Remove artillery and the defense lacks firepower. Remove air supply and the defense starves. Remove armor relief and the siege continues indefinitely. Everything mattered, everything connected. Calvert's transmission was one link in a chain, but chains break at their weakest link. His transmission could have been that weak link. His radio failing in the cold could have broken everything. It didn't. He warmed the battery. He got his transmission. The chain held. Everything continued. That's how battles work. That's how survival works. Everything matters, or nothing works. Modern communication makes what Calvert did seem trivial. We have satellite communications, we have encrypted digital radios, we have redundant systems and backup systems and systems to back up the backups. We have everything needed to ensure communications work. We forget how fragile communications were in 1944. One radio, one battery, one transmission. That's it. No backup, no redundancy. If it failed, mission failed. Soldiers died. Calvert got one chance. He made it work. That's skill. That's training. That's understanding your equipment well enough to know what to do when it fails. Modern reliability obscures how much ingenuity and desperation earlier generations needed. They made do. They improvised. They succeeded despite primitive equipment because they understood what mattered and focused on that. The 241 C-47s that flew supply missions to Bastogne represented enormous airlift capability. Each C-47 carried approximately 6,000 pounds of cargo. Multiply by 241 aircraft. That's over 1.4 million pounds, all delivered in 3 days. That's logistical capability that changed warfare. The ability to deliver that much supply that quickly enabled operations that would have been impossible previously. Armies historically moved at the speed of their supply trains, horse-drawn wagons, trucks, railroads, all slow, all vulnerable. Airlift changed that. Sudden, massive resupply anywhere aircraft could fly, as long as weather permitted, as long as anti-aircraft defenses could be suppressed, as long as ground forces could secure landing or drop zones. Many conditions, but when they aligned, airlift capability multiplied operational possibilities exponentially. Bastogne held for 6 days surrounded, relieved on December 26th. The siege cost both sides heavily. Americans suffered 1,500 casualties. Germans suffered more. Failed to take the objective, failed to break through, failed to maintain offensive momentum. Their losses included men, tanks, supplies, and most critically, time. Every day spent trying to take Bastogne was a day not spent advancing toward Antwerp. Every day delayed was a day Allied reinforcements moved into position. Every day mattered strategically. Holding Bastogne didn't win the Battle of the Bulge, but it prevented the Germans from winning. That's often how battles work, not through decisive victory, through preventing enemy victory, through denial, through attrition, through holding until help arrives. The 101st held. Help arrived. The Germans failed. That's victory. Ugly, costly, necessary victory.
This is the story of 4 words. Panels are out. 4 words that saved 2,000 lives. 4 words transmitted by one radio operator who understood his equipment, adapted when it failed, and got the message through despite weather, despite Germans, despite everything. Robert Calvert did his job, that's all. But doing your job at the critical moment is heroism. Making equipment work when it fails is skill. Enabling supply drops that save thousands is impact. None of it makes dramatic stories. All of it matters. History remembers McAuliffe's nuts. History should remember Calvert's 4 words. Both mattered. Both changed outcomes. Both deserve recognition. This is how we remember. This is how we honor. This is why we tell these stories. Because small actions have enormous consequences. Because forgotten heroes deserve recognition. Because understanding how battles are actually won requires understanding all the pieces, not just the dramatic moments. This is Calvert's story. This is Bastogne. This is how 4 words saved 2,000 lives.